I'll restart. So I'm Kimberley Renther, as Dylan introduced myself. I'm a grants advisor and project manager at Research Grant Support. So this means that I both help researchers apply for Marie Curie doctoral networks as well as manage the actual projects, which is actually something I really like, being involved in the full grant cycle, as we call it. So about me, so my background is in biomedical sciences. I did my PhD research at the Erasmus Medical Center, and then I transferred to research management. I used to start as a grant support officer and project manager for the Children's Hospital at the Erasmus Medical Center. And this is also where I got into contact with project management. So I actually started with the Pro EV Lifecycle project. And during that time, during the COVID pandemic, I actually transferred to VUMC, which was a very interesting time period to transfer. But then I managed the Myriade project from Charlotte Teunissen, which was on a dementia biomarker development, and this is now currently finished. I also support a lot of other applications, and I provide gap support, which means I help researchers set up contracts during after they got awarded and before the project actually starts. So we help them manage all this complex administrative workload. So I often refer to my job as being a webmaster. So there's no official EU project manager job description yet. They are working on this, both via EARMA, which is a professional network, but also the European Commission themselves are trying to professionalize the work, because they see that projects that involve a project manager run much more smoothly than those that do not. So what I would say in short, what are my main tasks would be to be the expert. You really have to know all the rules for EU projects, which in this case refers to the grant agreement and the consortium agreement. Most of all, those are always leading. You communicate both with the European Commission, but also internally with all the different support staffs, with the coordinator, with different PIs, with the fellows. There's a lot of requests for information, of course, but you really try to structure that as good as possible. Then one of my other major tasks would be to report. So if you run an EU project, you probably are aware that there's quite a lot of administrative workload. So we try to take that away from the researchers so they can actually work on the research content. Part of that is also keeping the project on track. So you have to monitor and collect a lot of information. We prepare amendments. I organize a lot of the trainings that are given in these types of projects, but I think also important to mention, I think my job really is a problem-solving job. So you really can get anything and every problem on your desk. It could be as simple as logistics during a meeting, but it can also go as far as helping fellows get visa applications, or even, well, I'll leave it at that, but it can be complex. So I'll move on next. Just a short recap. We'll not go into too much detail about the actual call, but as a refresher, Marie Curie Doctoral Network is a project that is aimed at training a maximum of 15 PhD students in an international, interdisciplinary and intersectoral manner to generate the next generation of researchers that fill a gap in your field of research. So the main thing in these types of projects, even though research is considered part of the training, the focus of these types of projects is really on the training. And that means also transferable skills such as grant writing and other types of training, a lot of industrial training, think about entrepreneurship. And then the research is actually considered part of the training by the European Commission. But for them, it's not the focus. So from Amsterdam UMC, we have a dedicated SharePoint website for our researchers. It's not available to you, so there's no link, but I just wanted to share a screenshot. So we actually provide intense support for Amsterdam UMC researchers to help them guide all the administrative processes, also in the application phase. So I will go very briefly through this, but it's important to mention that these types of projects, a fellow will have their own individual research projects. They can be seconded to another consortium member, and this is also for the purpose of training. They have, as I mentioned, different types of training. So that's really the core element. And they have to be exposed to other sectors. So what we generally recommend, if we have a fellow recruited by an academic organization, we always recommend to include a secondment to a non-academic partner. And that can be anything from policy area, it can be industry, it can be actually quite broad. In the end, the project should result in excellent employability of your researchers and increase research and innovation capacity in the European Union. So then very briefly about Amsterdam UMC. So even though the Marie Curie Doctoral Network is a competitive call, we are quite successful in this project. And I think this is because of the extensive support we provide with annotated templates and such. As a program, the Marie Curie Doctoral Network is relatively straightforward. As I mentioned, it's really about the training. So when you have the core elements of the actual Marie Curie Doctoral Network processed in your application, the chances of getting the award are actually quite good. So we have 11 active Marie Curie Doctoral Network coordinated projects and 16 beneficiaries, and this was actually with the last year included. At Amsterdam UMC, we also provide additional support from Marie Curie Doctoral Network applicants in the form of a 4th-year incentive arrangement. So in the Netherlands, the fellows, the actual PhD students, need a four-year trajectory to obtain their PhD, and obtaining the PhD is part of the goals of the Marie Curie Doctoral Network, which means we have 1 year lack of funding because a Marie Curie Doctoral Network is a maximum of 36 months. So Amsterdam UMC actually gives this kind of money as co-financing for a project like this. Additionally, on top of that, we also do additional matching. So we use European matching funds to actually give each coordinator another 60,000 per student in a Marie Curie Doctoral Network to cover the expenses not covered by the project. So this is something I will cover in a bit, because even though the finances are nice, for certain countries, and I'm not sure if this also applies to you, but for certain countries, they run into a lack of funding. So there is a gap, for example, for very expensive material costs, etc. So we'll explain a little bit more later on that. As I just briefly mentioned, but when you're setting up an application for a Marie Curie Doctoral Network, you need a minimum of 3 beneficiaries. So a beneficiary is an organization that is actually going to recruit a fellow and appoint them for, well, hopefully 36 months. There's a couple of different forms of doctoral networks. There's also an industrial doctorate, and there's a joint doctorate. These we don't have a lot of because the industrial doctorate is really focused at the industry, and a joint doctorate would require 2 organizations to have a joint doctoral program, and Amsterdam UMC doesn't have that currently with many organizations. So the maximum funding you can apply for in this call is 540 person months, which would be a maximum of 15 doctoral candidates in a doctoral network. One of the very important things to mention in this call is the mobility rule. So at Amsterdam UMC, because we are a medical organization, a medical university, it can be a bit difficult if it is a clinical project where we have to do clinical work, because you often have then a fellow recruited from abroad who doesn't speak the national language. So this is something we really warn our researchers about. But it is important to mention that you cannot recruit anybody who has resided more than 12 months in the preceding 36 months when you apply for the actual, or when you recruit the actual fellow. And then another thing in this call is that there's a 40% rule. So this means that no more than 40% of the total budget can go to one EU country, but this is excluding the central redistribution that I will mention in a moment. Are there any questions so far? Happy to take a few questions if you have any. Otherwise, I'll be happy to continue. Okay. So the funding mechanism for, oh yeah, I have a question. Rose?
Hi, that's Marco.
Hi, Marco.
Hi. So for the industrial PhD students, so you don't have that at the moment at the at AUMC. I would imagine that with some of the bigger industrial partners, this would be arrangeable.
Yeah.
Do you think it's also beneficiary for the chances of getting the grant?
So for industrial doctorate, there is really a lot more focus on the industry. So what we usually see is that industry is more of a caretaker, like coordinating these kinds of proposals. But yes, of course, if you have more industrial beneficiaries, then it makes a lot of sense to look for an industrial doctorate. But we currently do not have an industrial doctorate. That's true.
Yeah. I was thinking it may be something to think about for in the Netherlands, right? Elsevier, CPATH, maybe these kind of institutes would be ready for something like that. That's maybe something to think about later.
Yeah, as research support, we do actually apply for co-funds. So that's a different program, of course, but we do actually apply for co-funds where we try to recruit them postdoctoral fellows to our organization.
Yeah.
But not industrial doctorates.
And this is more a Dutch question, but do you know this arrangement that you have for the 4th year? Do you know if more Dutch institutes like the LUMC have such programs as well, such support?
Well, I don't know per organization, but a lot of them now currently do because there's a funding gap for, and this is actually applies to most universities in the Netherlands because we pay out according to the NFU rates. So there is then a gap at the end where you just don't have enough finances to cover the salary expenses. So I think most now do, but I do not know in detail.
Thanks.
Okay. You're welcome. So I'll continue with the funding mechanism then. A Marie Curie doctoral network is a unit cost project, which means you get paid out in the number of units that you use in a certain reporting period. In short, there's a fixed amount, and the number of months that you recruit your fellow, it's multiplied by that number of months. Then there's 2 categories. I want to briefly mention that here because I think it's nicely highlighted in this image. You have the contributions for recruited researchers, and those mainly include the living, mobility, and family allowance, as the long-term leave allowance and special needs allowance are only incidentally used. Long-term leave allowance is now being more used, but the living, mobility, and family allowance actually need to be paid out in full to the student in the form of salary. But these amounts do include national security costs. So that can be for insurances, for taxes and these kinds of constructions. But the institutional unit contributions are really meant for the institutions, so the beneficiaries that recruit the student. And then there's 2 separate unit costs that are distinguished here. There's the research training and networking contribution, and there's the management and indirect cost contribution. And usually the coordinator of a project will take part of the institutional unit contributions to appoint a project manager and to cover any central costs of the project, because there's always a couple, because there's a mutual training program and such. So I will go to the next slide. Yeah. So this explains a little bit more about the actual contributions for researchers. As I mentioned, it's based on the number of person months. And the living allowance is usually corrected by a correction coefficient. So in the Netherlands, the standard amount, which were just mentioned in the table, those are actually still adjusted for the country on which the fellow is recruited. So that amount, as I mentioned, is a gross amount, so it will not cover, so it covers taxes, social security, pension, and voluntary deductions. So in that sense, I think it's important to mention this because a lot of fellows will be recruited to a Marie Curie doctoral network, and they will think that they will get these amounts mentioned in the previous table paid out in full. Of course, then they come to the conclusion, oh, actually, that's not the net amount that I see on my salary slip. So what's happening here? So it usually requires a lot of attention in explaining to the fellows on how their salary is built up and what they actually get during the project, but also as an end payment at the end of the project, at least at Amsterdam UMC. So it is something to really monitor, but because this comes back in every single doctoral network, it doesn't matter how much attention we put to this, but the fellows always start asking questions about the salary because they will also compare their own salary with other fellows in the network based in other countries. And then they see these differences and they don't understand that. Okay, so not to linger too long on this, but then there's a mobility allowance, which is, as I mentioned, also part of the payout in their salary. This is really not meant for professional mobility costs. It's important to mention this because this is often a surprise to applicants, to organizations, that the housing costs and, for example, travel congress costs have to be paid from the institutional research training and networking budget. So the fellows cannot be held responsible to pay, for example, the cost of relocating to another location where they have to do their secondment. Then finally, the family allowance, which actually for us is quite important as Amsterdam UMC. So if a fellow is entitled to a family allowance, and they are entitled to that when they either are married or get married, or they have children or will get children during the runtime of the project. I'm mentioning that because before in Horizon 2020, it used to be assessed at the beginning of the project. Now it's also during. So the family status can change. Before you wouldn't get the family allowance, but nowadays you get an additional amount for each month that you recruit the fellow with family allowance. And for us, that's very important because it allows us to actually cover some of the gap, of the financial gap that we have because the funding is not sufficient to pay out the full salary. So for us, having a fellow with family allowance is actually very advantageous. Okay, so then I will go to the, the special, the long-term leave allowance and special needs allowance I will leave for now. So as I mentioned, the long-term leave allowance is for doctoral candidates that actually go on long-term leave, so more than 30 consecutive days. So that applies during the runtime of the project. And special needs allowance is to pay for any alterations you would need to, for your organization. Think of, for example, a ramp. If your student has a wheelchair, then you will be able to buy a ramp with this allowance to make sure that they can reach the lab and do their work. So the most common issue in the DN application is, as I mentioned before, is actually the payout, and that those amounts, the unit cost contributions, are gross amounts and not net amounts. So it's really important to inform your fellow of the actual amounts that they will receive in the form of salary. So I briefly mentioned it, but you see some points here. In the Netherlands, we have a national system of how we pay out a salary, so we have to stick to that. And then whatever is not paid out to the student at the end of the project, we pay out as an extra payment at the end. Our Dutch national contact point, which is the Rijksdienst voor Ondernemen Nederland, the Dutch enterprise agency, actually provides very nice information on the financial aspect of Marie Curie actions. I happily invite you to look at the link later on, but it is very specific to the Netherlands, so it might be that your national contact point will have their own information and guidance on the financial aspect of a Marie Curie doctoral network. So then we get to the institutional costs. So as I mentioned, there were two forms. There's the research training and networking, and then there's the management and indirect costs. Actually, a lot of costs will fall under your research training and networking costs. So think of the purchase of your materials, bench fees, the travel to workshop and meetings, as I mentioned, secondment costs, but also tuition fees or visa expenses, language courses, because students will need to know the local language, residency cards, a lot will fall under this budget. And then usually there's a partial redistribution to the central costs for the training activities. This usually lies between 20 to 40% of the budget. For the management and indirect costs, the coordinator usually takes about 50% of the management budget, which is quite a lot, but there's also really a lot of management work in that sense in these types of projects. And that's really hard for coordinators to do by themselves. Actually, it's not possible to really implement a project properly if you don't have support for this. So we always take the standard that's been proposed by the German coalition of lawyers, and there they recommend to withhold 50% of the budget as a standard, but it is very dependent on how many fellows you have, what kind of costs will you have centrally. So we try to tell our Amsterdam UMC researchers to really think already about the budget, even if it's only in the proposal phase, because it leads to so much discussion. It can lead to so much discussion once the project gets awarded and other beneficiaries find out that part of their budget is being withheld for central costs. So we do try to be very open and transparent about that. So yeah, this is the amounts that I just mentioned. So as a final statement here, I do want to mention that it's really dependent, the final retainments are really dependent on a couple of factors. It's not just the number of doctoral candidates, but really on what you want to cover with that budget. So we really try to proactively think with researchers on how we can reduce central costs. And this can be, for example, by combining training weeks with annual meetings and making sure we don't have more than necessary travel to certain locations, for example. So I will get to this part. Let me just pause for a second again. Is there any questions about the funding mechanism here? Okay, yes, Petros?
Hi, thank you. So I have some questions about the central funds. So the amount that is retained for training and networking, what kind of activities does it cover? Is it only kind of the venue and the coffee breaks and things like that, or does it pay the trainers and the travel or specific people in those training activities?
Yeah, good question. So yes, actually, Bo, it depends, of course, how you structure your program. But indeed, as part of the research training and networking retainment to the coordinator, part of that will be to cover the expenses, mostly for the venue. There will be some catering in that. You will have to provide some catering if of course, the consortium needs to spend a full day at the location. And usually what we try to do is also actually not make a single training day, but combine it with a couple of days. So have like a full training weekend, combine as much as we can. Otherwise, we will try to look at online options. But costs for a trainer would indeed be covered by the central budgets. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And regarding the remaining 50% of the management cost, which amount is indirect cost from that? Is it fixed, or each institution decides on its own allocation?
Okay. So for the management and indirect cost, the amounts are fixed. I will go briefly back to let me just see if I can easily go back to that slide. Yeah, the table. So the management and indirect cost contribution is fixed. So that's 1,200. And then Amsterdam UMC or other coordinators, actually, this is quite common. It's not just Amsterdam UMC, but they will retain 600 of each month. So this is a unit cost is for each month. So they will retain 50% of that. The other 50% will, of course, stay with the beneficiary because they also need this money to cover any overheads. They will maybe need it to buy some time for themselves to do some management or supervision for the students within the project. So those kinds of costs will be in that jar.
Yeah, but well, my question is about that remaining 50% that remains to the institution.
Yeah.
As a consortium, do you define whether the whole amount will go for indirect costs or whether, half of it will be overheads and other half for management or whatever?
Okay, no, that's very organization dependent. So I wouldn't be able to say exactly that, but I think most of it will go into overheads, I would presume, because usually that's quite a lot. That's quite a lot of funding. But for Amsterdam UMC, the overhead is limited to, I think, 14% or something like that. But actual overheads have been calculated to be up to 40% of research projects. But this is not covered. We can't cover that from the budget, so we don't take that.
Okay.
I hope that helps a bit, but
Yes,
I can't say for your organization what the situation is. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, then I'll move to the last part if there are no further questions. So from project management perspective, we've set up a couple of tips for different phases of the project. So when it comes to the actual application, setting up the application, we really recommend to only include key deliverables and milestones, because this would really reduce the administrative burden for both researchers and a project manager, and especially do not condense them too much either at the beginning or the end of the project, because these are relatively these are periods with a relative high workload. So you want to actually spread out deliverables and milestones as much as possible over the project, and preferably not too many at the beginning, because setting up the project and wrapping up the project actually take a lot of time in terms of reporting, setting up contracts, and these kinds of things. In terms of the budgets, as I already mentioned, we really recommend to combine training weeks with network meetings to limit any costs. And we really urge researchers not to plan too long of a secondment, because a long secondment usually also means higher costs in terms of housing and other costs that are associated to the secondment. So we really try to urge the researcher to think about the actual use of the secondment, and only go for a max duration if it's scientifically justified. Then when it comes to the implementation phase, so this is the part where your project has already started, we really recommend to monitor the secondments closely, because switching the timing and location of secondments is generally accepted, but reducing the time is not. And this is from the European Commission perspective, just to make it clear. This is not nothing else. It's the European Commission. They do not want you to reduce the timing of a secondment, whereas usually they're quite flexible in the switching either timing or location. During the COVID pandemic, this was actually quite difficult, because, of course, there were a lot of restrictions to travel. So then we really had problems with organizations that were reducing the time of the secondment because they had no choice. In the end, this was accepted because we had a force majeure during the runtime of the project, which is pretty much a fancy way of saying that the European Commission identified that the COVID pandemic was a force beyond reckoning that we couldn't influence. So then we got a bit more flexibility in that regard, but I had to provide very detailed justifications on why secondments were adjusted as they were. In terms of training and dissemination, we really recommend to look into possibilities of shared training. So on the website Cordis, you can find a lot of other EU projects that are currently running in your field. So we really recommend to look at any possibility that you can collaborate with these projects and actually do joint training. We also actively involve our doctoral candidates in dissemination activities. So, for example, in running social media accounts and public presentations. But because the communication and dissemination requirements from the European Commission have become so extensive, we now also recommend to bring a company on board that has experience in communication of these projects. There's a couple like Ubic Media. I don't know them all by heart, but there's a couple of them. So we really tell our beneficiaries to, our coordinators to bring this kind of company on board that can help them with communication and dissemination activities, because it can take up a lot of your time. Then for the recruitment, it's really important to mind the fellow eligibility rules. As I mentioned, you have to recruit an international student. They have to be doctoral candidates, which means they cannot have a doctoral degree at the date of recruitment. And you have to mind the recruitment process requirements. So recruitment has to be open and transparent, which is a standard EU requirement. But there's very detailed documentation on this. But I would really recommend just involve your human resources department. They really have to help you navigate the recruitment of these types of projects. You have to post your vacancy or your access. So this is usually done via your HR department. And you have to ensure equal opportunities to all applicants while being conscious of gender and diversity. So this is part of the requirements for that open and transparent recruitment. It's important to mention that the compliance is checked, so the EU will actually ask you to report on the recruitment process. So how many applicants did you have? How many were male? How many were female? What was their nationality? So really important to keep records of this. When the time comes, you will need it to report on the recruitment. As I mentioned, that the salary is often the part that's most confusing to fellows. So try to be as clear as possible in explaining the salary in your vacancy and mentioning the mobility requirements. Some students kind of are surprised in the end that they have to be sent out, for example, to secondment to another country because they didn't understand that was part of the work. After recruitment, we really recommend to plan a meeting with your doctoral candidates at Amsterdam UMC to explain their salary. And it's good, again, to stress here that the institutional costs and how it's spent, so the expenditures, are decided by the supervisor or the PI at the organization and not by the fellow. So the actual organization can decide themselves how they want to spend that money, not the fellow. And that was in brief my explanation on the management of these types of projects.
Thanks, Kimberly. Thank you. It was great. Let's see if anyone has any questions.
Yeah. Hello, Marco. Another question? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I also have questions, if that's okay. So I already posted one on you mentioned to sort of consider the length of the secondments, and that could you give an indication of what is long, what is short, what range should we think of?
So the maximum duration of a secondment is 1/3 of the total recruitment period. So that means that if you have a maximum of 36 months, a third would be 12 months. So that would be the max duration. But in general, we recommend secondment lengths to be 3 to 6 months max. Okay. And then you can do multiple secondments. So if you feel that that is advantageous to the student and to the project, we would recommend prefer to do 2 shorter secondments than 1 particularly long one.
Yeah, no, it's important for me to know that the minimum is 3 months, because if you want to do some research project together, then that seems to be the minimum time you would need.
Yeah, in our perspective, that it makes the most sense. In a period of 3 months, the student can actually train on something that's not from their own research field, let's say, directly.
Yeah. And can I have one additional question? Was you mentioned that it's good to combine training across projects. I really like that idea. I also know that project officers and accountants for the projects can be anal about double funding and double dipping, this kind of terms. Mm-hmm. Isn't that an issue here then as well? Is that I think it's rather ridiculous that they think this, but that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, no, I get
how is that in this situation?
Yeah. So at least one of the advantages of the unit cost contributions, although it can be a bit more complex to explain financially, but the advantageous thing about it is that during the reporting periods, you will have to report on the number of months that the fellow is recruited. So pretty much you have to prove that the fellow was working during that period for the number of months that you claim that they were. But after that, how the funding is spent is not checked. So that makes it a lot more easier. I would just consider it advantageous if you can combine training with another European project, because you would split, for example, the cost of the revenue, of the venue, sorry. So it would be less expensive. It won't be a
problem on the Marie Curie side. It may be still that we have to explain things carefully in the other project.
Well, I think you make agreements with the other project. I would say if you do a shared training, it might not be all the training in a training week, because the project usually have this construction where they combine all the training in 1 week. I can imagine that the students within your project might not be interested in all of that, but only a part. And then I can imagine that you can agree on, for example, sharing the cost for the lecturer or the person giving the training, and then you would split evenly, I would say. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Petrus?
Yes, thank you. So I have a question related to the consortium agreement, especially when we approach private companies to join the consortium. So we have full beneficiaries and associated partners. When you sign consortium agreement, do you sign only between the beneficiaries, or you also include associated partners there? And what is your experience with dealing with private companies in terms of IP and all these kind of points? Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good questions. For the consortium agreement, there are two templates that they use in Marie Curie networks. There's an associated partner version and there's one without. So depending on which version your legal department has preference for, either only beneficiaries sign or beneficiaries and associated partners. For Amsterdam UMC, it's the latter. So they ask associated partners to sign the consortium agreement because they don't want any confusion about it afterwards. So they want that commitment from, for example, companies that are associated to the project, because they often have a large role with the secondments, and you don't want to get into a discussion where they won't be able to provide the secondments as promised in the original proposal. This, I think, is their reasoning. So that was one part of the question. Indeed, there's different ways for a company, of course, to be involved in a project like this. For a Marie Curie doctoral network application to be successful, we see that at least one company, preferably two, needs to be on board as a full beneficiary. They really have to recruit a fellow and appoint them at their organization where they will do actual work. But this is also the most tricky part, because a lot of companies cannot promise that kind of dedication. And you also have to be mindful that if your country, for example, has a requirement for a longer PhD period, then part of that budget might not be covered for additional training, let's say, for additional appointment, which means that a company, they cannot give the doctoral degree. So they will have an associated partner that will provide the doctoral degree. Then you really have to be clear on what happens for that period, because the students are required to officially get a PhD degree. It's not checked, but this is part of the concept of a doctoral network. Does that answer most of your questions?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Nice questions. I see a couple of questions in the chat. Sorry, let me check those. I would like to ask two questions regarding the current call for application. In the event that question. In the event that the recruitment procedure does not identify a suitable candidate, what is the next step? So we often see in projects that it's difficult to find a suitable candidate in the first round of recruitment. So we actually have seen that there's actually a second or even a third round of recruitment. This also is then another implementation challenge, because you will have students that have started very early, perhaps at month 6 of the project, and then there's other students that will not have been recruited until usually the beginning of the second year. This is quite common though, so it happens more often. The second question was, does the call allow only the activation of new PhD programs, or is it also possible to include research topics and projects within existing PhD programs? Okay. No, well, so if you apply for a Marie Curie doctoral network, the application has to be state-of-the-art. So I would say that it's fine to hook onto new initiatives, but I wouldn't say it's the main aspect of it. Is that the correct? Am I answering the correct question? Because it's a bit unclear to me if I'm interpreting this correctly. Okay, let me know via the chat or a shout out if that didn't answer your question. But in principle, a Marie Curie doctoral network should always be a new innovative idea with a new training network to train the next generation of researchers. So I would say no. Okay. Yeah, and Marco's question is answered, long or short. Okay, great. Coralea, do you have a question?
Thank you so much for this presentation. So I'm quite new to this course overall. To be honest, I didn't go through the guidelines for these, but you mentioned secondments. You said that it's okay to change, let's say, the number of secondments, but not recommended to change the duration. So I presume this is something that needs to be specified at the stage of the application. And how strict is that? For example, I presume secondment needs might change regarding the challenges one faces in the project. So you cannot anticipate certain things. You can say, we will provide training as needed. We have identified these partners with expertise, but the length of the secondment, let's say, for training purposes or other type of educational, let's say, activities might actually depend on the progress that is made in the project and the challenges that are faced in the project. So just a little bit of explanation on that. Do we need to be specific in the writing phase, or we can just leave the door open to, let's say, depending on the challenges we face? Thank you.
Well, try to be as specific as possible, definitely at the application phase. This is because your proposal, when it is awarded, it's how you say that? It's accepted based on what you've written in the proposal, and whatever the proposal will actually become the declaration the description of action in the grant agreement. In other words, it becomes direct part of the contract with the funder. So they see it as, this is something you promise and this is how you implement it. But that being said, of course, they have flexibility. They will be open to any discussion. If the supervisor, for example, believes that a secondment should either be lengthened or changed to a different organization, they're very happy to accommodate that. But you do have to ask permission beforehand. So I would say it's a lot of extra work for you if you want to change it. So do try to be as specific as possible in the application phase, but know that, of course, the European Commission allows for flexibility as long as you are open and transparent about it. The problem with the COVID pandemic that we had is that a lot of our beneficiaries had changed the duration of their secondments without us informing the project officer, and that was not appreciated very much.
Thank you.
So this is also something really to keep in mind. If you are coordinating a proposal, the secondments, you really have to monitor them and check them, and they have to be implemented as described in the application. Yeah. But flexibility is there. Okay. I have a warning from Teams, but I'm not sure if there's another question. No. Don't see any other questions.
Yeah, I also don't see any other questions. I have one thing that I want to just ask, because I think you mentioned it in your presentation regarding the dissemination and communication activities. You mentioned that you would recommend the consortium to take board like an external company for this kind of events, I think. Did you mean that they can be subcontracted by one of the consortium members? Or did you mean that they would be part of the consortia?
Yeah, so a unit cost project doesn't have subcontracting. So this, what would happen is that you would calculate these costs under central costs. So I would try to minimize them as much as possible, but the communication and dissemination activities can actually cost quite a lot of time, which is not covered. So there's a project manager appointed. Usually it's at least half an FTE or one FTE. If you have a 1 FTE project manager, you can imagine that they would be able to do some of the communication dissemination activities relatively easily. But in our experience, if you have a project manager for half an FTE in a project, then you run short on time for communication and dissemination activities. So it depends a bit on context, but these kinds of companies, they have a lot of experience with them. They do it really well. And if you can imagine certain activities like explainable videos, that is something you could, of course, choose to do with a mobile phone and record your students and then having explain a pitch of the project. But it looks so much better when a company does it. So it is a bit of preference of the PI, but I would really recommend to, at least for some activities, involve a company and cover the costs from the central management and indirect cost category. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Okay, I don't think we have any other questions. All right, I think it's okay that if we close the session. I think that all the really helpful and really good presentation. We had a lot of great discussions. There was a lot of interest. So thanks again for your time, Kimberly.
Thanks for
and
inviting me.
accepting everyone. And I also would like to thanks to Esther for helping us to organize this session as a work package leader of the project management and administration for HIMA Fair. Thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
You too, and good luck with all the
Thank you.
applications.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.